What's up guys, I'm Fedor Holz and today I'm going to hit you with the 7 biggest pre-flop mistakes that poker players are making, especially on the beginner level. Let's start with number 1. Let's get right into it. The first mistake that the most players, especially when they start out playing, but even further on micro and lower stakes make, is that they play too many hands. They don't understand which hands to play from which position. So for this, I definitely recommend to look at some charts to get an understanding of which hands to play from what position. And generally think about it, the earlier you are, so the more players are behind you, the less hands you can play. Don't just look at your cards and think, oh, this looks nice. Try to look at some pre-flop hand charts and kind of get an understanding of which hands to play from what position. That is rule number 1, that you shouldn't be playing too many hands from any position and that it all follows a strategy. So the first mistake I see is players playing too many hands and just want to see a flop. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to stick to the strategy of generally raising and playing tighter from early position. But more to this in the other mistakes. Second pre-flop mistake ties right into this, is that players play too passive. And this is probably the most costly one. They play too many hands, mistake 1, but then they play them passive. So they limp in, they get the ace-3 off and it's just, oh, let's limp and see a flop. Don't do that. Not a good play. Limping, initially, I would just cut from your repertoire. Don't open limp in the games you're playing, whether it's cash game or tournament. Second mistake, let's not do it. We don't play passive. We try to play generally more aggressive, kind of the tag style, so tight aggressive style. So we don't play too many hands, and when we play them, we don't play them passive, but we rather play them aggressive. Those are the first 2 mistakes that kind of tie together. The third mistake that a lot of players make is that they don't understand positional awareness. And this is really important, and it kind of ties together with the first 2. Which position you sit on is extremely important. So the difference between early position, so let's say you're first to act in an 8-player game, or if you're cut off, which is 1 player right to the button, or if you're on the button, or if you're in a big blind, it's very, very different positions. And from each position, you have to take your position versus the others into account. So when we're first to act early position, so it's called under the gun, then there's, for example, 7 players left to act. We have to play much less hands, much tighter than when we're on the button. And that's generally something that when you start out, I see way too many players make this mistake to not take that into account. So always be aware of position, because when you're on the button, you're going to be in position against whoever continues against you. And that's a big advantage, especially bigger the deeper you are. So always look for your positional advantage. Now, mistake number 4 is players playing too tight out of the big blind. When you are in the big blind, you have committed 1 big blind already. If, let's say, someone open raises to 2 big blind, then you only have to call 1 big blind into a pot of 4.5 or 5, depending if there's antes or not. That is very important to take into account. When you only have to call 1, there's much less you have to win on average of that pot, comparing to, let's say, you have to risk 2 big blinds or 3 big blinds. Take that into account, that generally as a beginner, when you are in the big blind and someone open raises to 2, and it really depends on how big they open raise, you get a good price in the big blind, and you can look at the flop, for example, with all suited hands and some of the medium strong offsuit hands. So that is something to take into account, that when you're in the big blind, don't play too tight. That is very important because it will have a big impact on your win rate. Now, the 5th mistake ties in very closely to what I talked about earlier, is the open raising and the raising strategy, or what hands we play, and it's specifically regarding the button. So on the button, everyone has folded to us, for example. There's only 2 players left to act. And the difference between an early position player and the button is rather big in those scenarios. So we need to make sure that we raise a lot of hands from the button. On average, in most situations, this is between 40 and 60% of the hands. As a rule of thumb, half of the hands you should be raising when you're on the button and it gets folded to you. Half of the hands is quite a lot. So don't play 100% of your hands and don't play 20% of your hands. That is very important when you're on the button. This is a big mistake when you play too many hands or when you play too little hands. So something along the lines of every second hand. So you can kind of think of, okay, 3-7 off is not good enough, but 7-8 is maybe right on the fence, and Jack 10 you definitely need to play. So get a good idea of what every second hand kind of means, and then you're going to be good on the button. It's a very easy to fix leak, and when you fix it, your win rate is definitely going to improve. So that's the 5th mistake. Make sure to play the correct amount of hands from the button. Very important. Now, if we go to the 6th beginner mistake, a lot of players on low and even mid stakes sometimes make, is that they overvalue offsuit broadways. Especially in cash games, you see that when you're 100 big blinds deep and let's say it's middle position against early position, players are overvaluing the king jack offsuit or the jack 10 offsuit or queen jack offsuit. Those are playable hands, but especially deep stack, you're going to be on the weaker end quite often. You don't make flushes, the top pairs you make are quite often dominated. So those are hands that generally are being overvalued. So make sure when you play them, they get much stronger when you're short stacked and they get stronger when you're late position, when you dominate other players' hands. So as a rule of thumb there, when you're generally more often dominated, the strength of the hand, especially deep stack, goes down. So if you have jack 10, your opponents are mostly going to play king jack and ace jack and ace 10 and king 10, and your hand is not going to make very good top pairs very often. You're going to have a decent top pair, but then you don't know in a bigger pot if you're being dominated, if your opponent has an even stronger top pair. So that is very important to keep into account, especially when we go deeper stack. Don't overvalue those offsuit broadways. Now, as the last mistake that you should be avoiding and not be making in game, especially pre-flop, don't mix it up. That's the funniest one. And a lot of players, especially when they start out, like, how could you know what I have and what I'm doing if I don't know myself? That's not what it's about. I don't need to know what's going on in your head. If you make a bad play, it's a bad play. So if you do something that's losing money, confusing me is not the thing that will make you money. Making good plays is the thing that makes you money. So if you do something stupid, if you do something that's out of the box, generally you're just going to lose more money with it. Mixing it up is not really a thing you should be doing in poker ever. Increasing the variance against a good player, that's a decent idea, but don't suddenly open raise a hand you should never be open raising. Don't open raise the 9-3 off or the 10 deuce because you've seen Doyle play it. It's not a good idea. I would say that in those type of scenarios, especially when you start out, try to think of what is a decent strategy that I can play, and don't try to confuse someone or mix it up. It's not a good thing. Those are my 7 pre-flop mistakes that you should be avoiding. I do think that especially when you start applying, those are the things you should just work through, strategically make sure that your pre-flop game is sound, that you don't make those mistakes. And to sum it up, don't play too many hands. Don't play them too passive. No limping. We are open raising. Take awareness, or make sure you're aware of your positional advantage or disadvantage. Position is very, very important in poker. Make sure that you hit your right frequencies out of the big blind. You shouldn't play too tight. Depending on the open sizing, we can defend wider out of the big blind. Make sure that you play the right amount of hands from the button. From the button, we have the positional advantage. We want to make sure we get into quite some pots, about 50% of the time. Don't overvalue offsuit broadways, especially deep stack and earlier position. They are not as strong as you might think. And don't try to mix it up. Those 7 pre-flop mistakes, if you watch out for them and try to improve your game in those, I can guarantee your win rate immediately makes a jump upwards, especially on the lower stakes. So if you start out playing poker, those would be the first 7 tips that I'd give you. I hope this helps you. So if you start out and if you play low stakes and you want to get better, I would definitely make sure that you don't make those 7 mistakes. And then I'm pretty sure that you might be able to make it to the next level and improve your win rate, because if you fix those, you're already better than a lot of the competition on the lower stakes. So that's especially for players who are starting out and want to get to the next level. So I hope this helps you. Some tips from me based on my experience. And if you like this type of content, I'd love if you leave a subscribe, because then just gives me motivation to put out more content like that. And if there's other mistakes that you see people making a lot, please leave them in the comments. Would be really cool for other players to see. And I see you in the next video. Cheers. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to support the channel and stay always up to date, then leave a subscribe here or check out our next video.